The thunder came first, the distant, undeniable rattle of metal on road, a sound that turned veteran confidence into a cold, spreading dread. In May 1940, that noise was the new language of war, and once it reached a town, its people learned, often in hours, that the old rules no longer applied. When German Panzer divisions burst through the Ardennes, they did more than rout the French army. They rewrote modern warfare. In 6 weeks, France collapsed. Columns of tanks rolled past the Maginot Line as if it were scenery, and towns that had survived months-long sieges in the First World War fell in mere hours. The speed was incomprehensible to infantry still dressed, armed, and trained for 1918. Communications and command chains could not keep up. Technically, German armor was not always superior. Many French tanks matched or out-armored their opponents. But doctrine, fast, coordinated strikes combining panzers, Stukas, and motorized infantry created an aura of invincibility. Where tanks arrived, panic often followed. Men who had learned to hold trenches found themselves running from a different kind of predator. Anti-tank rifles, the infantry's standard defense, were soon exposed as inadequate. The British Boys rifle, heavy and punishing to handle, could only threaten the thinnest armor at close range. The newer Panzer models carried frontal plating that made such weapons practically useless. Dunkirk, from May 26 to June 4, 1940, burned the lesson into British minds. The evacuation saved 338,226 soldiers but left nearly all heavy equipment on French soil. Tanks, artillery, vehicles, and the anti-tank guns that might have stopped an armored advance. Britain suddenly faced a real prospect of invasion with almost nothing that could reliably stop a Panzer spearhead. The Wehrmacht began sketching plans for Operation Sea Lion, buoyed not by propaganda but by what their commanders had watched happen in France. Infantry breaking before armor, pockets of resistance overwhelmed, collapse spreading faster than reinforcements could arrive. German crews were trained to press the advantage. Bold, aggressive tank commanders often found that audacity created openings that careful caution never would. The psychological effect fed the tactical one. Troops expecting defeat fled, and their flight made defeat more likely. Returning soldiers from the continent reported how tanks seemed to appear wherever defenses were weakest, how reconnaissance and speed allowed German forces to bypass strong points and strike at the seams. British planners realized the urgent need for an infantry anti-tank weapon, something small, mobile, and lethal enough to be carried and hidden by a single soldier, yet powerful enough to pierce the armor of any German tank then in service. Conventional anti-tank guns like the 2-pounder were effective when properly sighted but required time, transport, and predictable emplacements. Reconnaissance and air spotting made those positions vulnerable. What foot soldiers needed was a discreet, portable killer, an item that could wait in a hedgerow or a ruined house and strike at point-blank weakness before a tank commander even knew an attack was coming. The engineering problem was brutal. Defeating armor usually meant a very high-velocity projectile fired from a heavy gun or a much larger explosive charge. Both options created weight and complexity. Sticky bombs, magnetic charges, and anti-tank grenades all had fatal flaws in real combat. Molotov cocktails worked only against older tanks. The specification set in 1941 read like a catalog of contradictions. 1 or 2 men must carry and fire it. It must reliably penetrate roughly 75 millimeters of armor. It must work at a useful range, about 100 yards, be simple enough for conscripts to use, robust in mud and rain, cheap to mass produce, and not rely on scarce materials or complicated machining. Design teams attacked the problem from many angles through 1940 to 41. Then one solution rose from an unlikely principle: a spigot mortar, where the projectile fit over a central rod instead of being fired from inside a conventional barrel. This allowed a much larger warhead relative to the launcher's size. And another team chased a very different idea. Picking up from that spigot mortar approach, engineers turned to the old Monroe principle: a hollowed metal liner that, when the explosive around it detonated, reshaped into a searing jet able to bore through armor far thicker than the blast alone could. Decades-old physics suddenly offered a way to cheat the weight versus power problem. A relatively small charge could produce a molten metal jet moving at hypersonic speed and focused pressure intense enough to slice through tank plating. By early 1942, these strands of research began to converge. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker, an eccentric ordnance officer, pushed a startlingly simple manufacturing idea: abandon scarce propellants and drive a man-portable launcher with a massive coiled spring. Steel springs could be made in ordinary workshops, demanded no special handling, and wouldn't explode in storage. It sounded ridiculous until the math was checked. A tightly wound spring could hurl a 3-pound warhead far enough to be tactically useful. Trials through 1942 were a rough schooling. Early prototypes were temperamental, sometimes dangerous to the crew, and occasionally refused to fire. Yet when they worked, the shape-charge bombs did what no rifle or grenade could: they punched through armor plate in tests. The new weapon, nicknamed the Projector, Infantry Anti-Tank, PIAT, emerged in late 1942 as an ungainly but promising answer. At roughly 32 pounds unloaded, it looked like a heavy tube with a shoulder rest and a bomb trough. The spring inside required immense effort to cock. Soldiers lay on their backs, braced their feet, and hauled a lever with everything they had to compress the mechanism. The warhead itself was the clever part: a 9-centimeter charge with a precisely formed copper cone that, when detonated, collapsed into the destructive jet. Because the shaped charge's penetration depended on explosive geometry rather than projectile speed, the relatively slow spring launch was acceptable. The launcher's quirks were many. There was no conventional trigger. The firing pin struck the bomb's primer as the spring drove it forward, and the recoil pulled the mechanism back to recock it. If a shot misfired or the crew failed to hold it correctly, the whole exhausting cocking process had to be repeated. The kick on firing was vicious. Standing shots could topple the firer. Training manuals brimmed with warnings: never fire in enclosed spaces, always seat the bomb fully, keep the mechanism properly maintained. Still, when used correctly, the PIAT gave infantry a compact, manufacturable weapon that could, at close range, turn a tank from an unstoppable monster into a vulnerable target. Perhaps the War Office preferred a bland, bureaucratic name, but soldiers quickly found their own. Some christened it the PAT bomb thrower, others used words not fit for print after feeling its shoulder-shredding recoil or wrestling the cocking lever under fire. Unlike the cumbersome boy's rifle, which troops avoided when they could, the PIAT earned hard-won respect. It was crude, exhausting, and dangerous, but effective. By mid-1943, PIATs were issuing to battalions bound for the Mediterranean with canvas carriers and a handful of the odd, dart-headed bombs, bulbous warheads on skinny tails that had to be handled with care. Beyond tanks, crews discovered these shaped charges wrecked bunkers, blew open concrete emplacements, and turned buildings into anti-tank firing positions. The invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, began July 10, 1943, proved the weapon's value. Narrow lanes, stone villages, and terraced hills made armored movement predictable and vulnerable. Near Centuripe, a PD team knocked out a Panzer IV at roughly 40 yards. The crew abandoned the vehicle as the shaped charge tore through its flank. Italy reinforced the pattern. At Salerno in September 1943, teams used the PIAT from upper floors to strike thin engine decks. One corporal set a Stu G3 ablaze by firing down into its rear. The launcher's real advantage was tactical. Unlike towed anti-tank guns, PIAT crews could hide, fire once or twice, then melt away into rubble before artillery found them. That mobility turned every hedge, window, and ruined house into a threat. German reports began noting British infantry hunting tanks rather than fleeing them. Tactically, PD teams operated in pairs, a firer and an assistant carrying extra bombs and watching for threats, because each 3-pound bomb was heavy and a man could only carry a few. Ammunition scarcity mattered. Once the small stock was gone, the team was effectively out of business unless resupplied. When the Allies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the bocage made the PIAT indispensable. Sunken lanes and tight fields forced tanks into predictable paths where concealed teams could strike flanks at close range. During Operation Epsom, late June, infantry dug in among hedgerows and engaged armor at ranges pre-war doctrine had called suicidal. Sergeants and small teams halted Panzer IVs and immobilized others by targeting tracks and engine decks. German armor doctrine, built on speed and shock, had to change. More infantry screens, more cautious advances, and slower movement followed, because every hedge might conceal a PIAT. The psychological shift was decisive. Tank crews who once inspired terror now approached villages and lanes with fear. The PIAT's kills mattered, but its greatest victory was restoring infantry agency. Operating one demanded strength, nerve, and endurance. Consider the sequence. You've just taken the shot. If you're lucky, the spring has auto-recocked. If not, you face the nightmare. The bomb, a bulky 3-pound dart, must be eased tail first into the trough with the primer exactly aligned while your hands tremble. The tank may be disabled or already pivoting its turret toward your hiding place. You have seconds before gunners turn your cover into a killing zone. Recocking a stubborn PIAT could mean lying on your back, feet braced on the shoulder rest, and heaving the cocking lever with everything you've got. Veterans compared it to leg pressing 200 pounds under fire. In confined spaces or mud, it could take up to 90 seconds. That's why the two-man team became standard. The firer lugged the PIAT and 1 or 2 bombs. His mate carried extra rounds, kept watch, gave covering fire, and, if needed, tried to take over a weapon that was awkward to hand off in combat. Officially, the PIAT's range reached about 115 yards, but in practice, effective, reliable hits came inside 30 to 50 yards. The shaped charge demanded near-perpendicular impact. An oblique strike often failed. That meant waiting for tanks to expose flanks, to turn, or to slow, moments that required knowledge of terrain, nerves of steel, and perfect timing. Each shot punished the operator with brutal recoil. Repeated firing left shoulders black and raw. The cocking routine tore at muscles and backs. Some men suffered hernias from the strain. Ammunition limited teams to a handful of bombs, so once they were gone, the little unit was essentially harmless until resupplied. Yet when a PIAT connected correctly, the effect was decisive. The molten copper jet and pressure inside the hull maimed or killed crews, ignited fuel and ammo, and often put a vehicle permanently out of action. Many engagements became binary. You either knocked the tank out or you were discovered and likely killed. Stories from Normandy: tanks halted in village streets, Panthers forced to withdraw after near hits, single teams holding hills against armored counterattacks, show how PIATs restored infantry agency. The weapon didn't win every fight. Dozens of teams died trying. But unlike 1940, infantry now had a credible way to fight armor. The PIAT never became glamorous. It didn't get parade space or poetry. It was ugly, exhausting, and stubbornly effective, the kind of tool soldiers accepted because it let them live and fight. The fighting continued, and the next phase would test the weapon and its crews in ways nobody yet imagined. The PIAT's real victory was psychological more than mechanical. It didn't merely add to Allied kill counts, it changed how tanks were employed. Once PIATs were common, German crews could no longer assume infantry posed only a nuisance. Every window, hedge, and rubble heap became a possible firing point. That forced armored formations to move slower, demand greater infantry screens, and commit to far more cautious reconnaissance, all of which blunted the Wehrmacht's historic advantage of speed and shock. Where Blitzkrieg had relied on rapid concentration and surprise, PIATs and other portable anti-tank weapons helped drag warfare back toward close, grinding attrition. British infantry underwent an equally profound shift. Men who'd fled at the sound of tracks in 1940 learned to stand and think tactically in 1944. Locate the PIAT team, watch approach routes, wait for flanks or corners. That change in mindset mattered as much as any technical improvement. American forces watched and fast-tracked their own rocket launchers. Post-war Soviet and NATO designs absorbed the shape charge lesson. Modern man-portable anti-armor systems, RPGs, ATGMs, shoulder-fired rockets, trace their conceptual roots to these spring-launched shaped charges. The PIAT stayed in British service into the early 1950s, gradually replaced by more reliable, easier-to-use designs like the bazooka and later grenade launchers. Official records patchily document hundreds of PIAT successes. Many actions simply went uncounted. Conservative tallies suggest several hundred tanks were knocked out or disabled, but far more were deterred, routed, forced to reroute, or made to advance at crawl. Those absent tanks represent the weapon's truest payoff: deterrence and altered behavior that never shows on a ledger. Ultimately, the PIAT symbolized rapid, brutal adaptation. From the humiliation of 1940, Britain produced a crude, awkward tool that restored infantry agency. It wasn't pretty, and it didn't win alone, but repeated thousands of times across fields and villages, it helped change the balance on the battlefield. The next phase would push both weapon and crews into even harsher tests, and those tests would decide whether this improvised solution had lasting worth.